Welcome to another edition of the Keep Africa Trading Podcast, Trademark Africa's podcast that discusses everything around trade in Africa and how basically we can make it better for all the continents, countries, and people involved in trade. My name is Moses Kemibara. I'm your host. We are here in Kigali, Rwanda, where we are attending the Africa Trade Development Forum 2024 edition on the 2nd and 3rd of December. And this particular conference is focusing on digital trade. And we're looking at how basically digital trade can transform the continent in terms of trade opportunities and, more importantly, democratizing access to trade across every kind of business of every kind of size. Our next guest is going to give us some perspectives from our organization and what she does, and we're able to give us a perspective in terms of what is possible from a digital trade perspective on the African continent. Thank you so much for joining us, Kimberley.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So maybe you can introduce yourself and also the role that you're in and which organization you represent.
Absolutely. So my name is Kimberley Botwright, and I head sustainable trade at the World Economic Forum. We're an international nonprofit based in Geneva, Switzerland, but we work with countries and businesses all over the world. And my team focuses on trade and investment. I look specifically on sustainable trade, but I have also previously done a lot of work on digital trade and actually started some work on African digital trade back in 2018. So I'm delighted to be back here and to see the progress and the enormous exciting opportunities that are being generated in this space since I last came in 2018.
Maybe you can start by expounding a little bit more about what sustainable trade is, what that entails, because I know sustainability has become a big theme globally across so many contexts.
Yeah.
But what is that and what does it mean exactly?
Yeah, so we tend to look at it as the need to balance between economic growth, environmentally sustainable outcomes, so that production and consumption is within planetary boundaries, and then also that there's an inclusive side to sustainable trade, so that communities and small businesses are actually also benefiting from the opportunities of trade and not just large companies. Obviously, large companies can be a real engine. They can invest and there's a lot of technology transfer that can happen, but let's make sure that the landscape is also adjusted for small businesses too. So we really tend to take a very holistic approach. And I think the digital economy comes in as an enabler of sustainable trade. Well, let's say the digital economy is an enabler of trade, and then it can be particularly an enabler of sustainable trade.
Okay. So the theme of the conference obviously is digital trade. It's pretty much why we're all here. I don't know if you have any recollections or reflections based on the sessions you've been attending, possibly converging with the reason that you're here on behalf of the World Economic Forum. To give us a perspective again, just from your point of view, what are the possibilities? What's the situation? What's the way forward for digital trade in Africa?
Yeah, so I think, again, it's really exciting to look at the opportunities. So some of the work that the World Economic Forum is doing with partners is looking at how the digitization of trade processes can lower the cost to trade and how that can then increase the number of people and businesses who are engaging in trade. And so in the context of Africa, there are estimates out there that fully digitizing trade processes could reduce trade costs by 25%, which would hugely open up pathways for businesses to trade across the region and trade with the world. So that's something that we're looking at across a few different areas.
What are some of the key challenges to making digital trade a reality in the context of Africa?
So there's a few different ones. I think within the context of Africa, but it's not necessarily unique to the continent, is the digital economy is typically regulated at a national level. And so when we talk about trade, we're talking about exchange between different sovereign jurisdictions who are going to have different regulations. And so then there's a bit of a patchwork effect that can emerge. And so some of the ways that the digital economy could actually help trade, we actually don't see those benefits materializing because the regulation is different, because it's actually hard to figure out how to comply, because you've digitized the customs process in one place, but maybe not in the other place. So you then have to have parallel paper and digital processes, for example. Or if we take cross-border payments, which are the absolute engine of retail commerce, which is a huge opportunity, or retail e-commerce. But there again, the payments regulations can be very different between countries. So actually setting up and enabling countries to have conversations on how they want to regulate the cross-border flow of payments is quite a tricky conversation. A lot of trust has to be built between regulators around that. And so that's, again, as I said, not unique to the African continent. There's other regions, for example, in Asia, they've also struggled with this, but they're moving ahead with a digital trade agreement, which is quite interesting. Now, I know that within Africa, within the AfCFTA, there is a digital protocol. So I think that will be really interesting to see how that gets implemented and if that drives some of the conversations around regional policy that would be required to accelerate cross-border payments or other things that currently may be not fully tapped.
So you probably have a unique global perspective around digital trade. I mean, when in markets, so perhaps continents where you're seeing it really thrive, what are some of the attributes or things that you've noticed from that perspective?
I think so. If I was to look at Asia, where, for example, we do see particularly retail e-commerce and cross-border payments really thriving, it's because there's a real sync between the innovations that business are coming up with and the efforts by policymakers to talk between their countries to encourage that interoperability of regulations, so that then a business that maybe starts in Indonesia, for example, can go regional across ASEAN. And so I think what I find really great being back here after 6 years when I started working on digital trade in Africa is that I do see that conversation has really advanced in the region, that there is real thinking about how to have cooperation between governments to create a sort of an Africa e-commerce market or Africa digital trade market. But there's still a lot of implementation that has to happen.
So one of the things that we've been discussing here, even in the previous conversations on this podcast, is the question around inclusion, right? And really, when you look at Africa, we have this scenario where if you think about rural Africa, peri-urban Africa, access to smartphones might be a challenge. Financial scenarios can be a challenge, but also we know that that's where a lot of things like the agriculture happen. A lot of the commodities come out of these areas, and that's essentially foundational to the sort of trade opportunities that exist. How do we make sure that digital trade does not exclude some of these players who should be part of this, and how can we get them more involved and plugged in?
So I think that's again where the innovation has to be in lockstep in conversation with regulators. So, and the continent is kind of a leader in with regards to M-Pesa, which your neighbors developed, and that was before smartphones, but digital payments through SMS. And so that actually was incredibly opened up a lot of ways for particularly farmers who weren't banked to get banked and to be able to also then from that to then have interesting financial services provided, so loans that can, because suddenly you've got a credit rating because you're actually on the map.
Exactly.
So that I think is really interesting. But again, the financial system and the financial regulator has to be able to keep pace and not block that kind of innovation. So I guess what I'm saying is if we want those communities to use the digital economy, then there needs to be services and tools that are useful to them and to their needs. Particularly for farmers, I think it's important, and putting on my sustainability hat, I think there's a lot that could be done around climate smart agriculture and forecasting, building up resilience, making sure that there's smart information provided in a timely manner, also advice on crop plantation, when to harvest based on changing weather patterns, because that is a key kind of potential information silo where you have people that have this core information, they're in the expert community, but that's not trickling down to the farmers.
Yes.
And so how do we make sure that service is actually developed and created? I would tend to say the market should create it, but let's also make sure that regulation is in play to encourage that.
So looking to the future, let's say 5-10 years down the road, thinking about digital trade in the context of Africa, what are your thoughts around that? What do you think it might look like, 10 years out?
10 years out, so I read somewhere that digital trade, if we go even further out to 2050, so that would be 25 years' time, that digital trade could contribute to 8.5% of Africa's GDP. So it could also, in doing so, it would then create like 150 million jobs potentially. So if we then dial that back to where do we want to be in 10 years' time, well, hopefully we're already biting off some of those gains. And I think it will be important to almost set a baseline for where the region is today and where they want to be, but to think regional, that's what I would encourage. Like often there is a desire for countries to say, well, I'm going to think about how I'm going to grab this new exciting piece of the economic pie. But actually, I hope through all the examples I've been sharing, really engaging in a conversation and using the mechanisms like the AfCFTA to think about the types of cross-border economic cooperation that can help generate kind of regional e-commerce that will create a bigger market for all the players involved.
Actually, that's one of the consistent comments that I've been hearing, that we need to stop thinking at a national level.
Yeah.
We need to think at more regional, Pan-African level, and look at markets almost being seamless. In fact, there's a remark said that, I think it was the Zambian president made a remark like, we should have not a one-stop border post, we should have a no-stop border post.
Exactly.
So that everything essentially flows as if it were, a national boundary as opposed to between countries.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts around that sort of perspective,
Well, there's two reasons why. I mean, it's the ideal vision, but there's two reasons why it's hard, I think. So, and we should acknowledge those challenges so that they can be mitigated. The first is what I just mentioned, that everyone wants a piece of the pie. My taxi driver on the way over here, I said, having a conversation about the country and how it's changed in the last 6 years. And he said, look, it's great, but to be honest, we still don't have enough jobs for young people, which means that governments are under pressure to generate economic activity for their youngsters. And every single government across the region will be in the same position. So it's very easy to fall into the trap of let's generate jobs for us and not for them. But actually, as you've just said, we need to have a big market, because that's how we're going to leverage the economies of scale, so that when you create a business here, suddenly you're selling to 500, 600, 700 million as opposed to just that. Then the second thing I think is the challenge is trust. So once you get over the kind of economic theory hurdle, the reality is that we rely on our governments to put in place certain regulations. The payment system is a great example. We want to have a sound financial system. We rely on the government to legislate and then the financial regulator to act accordingly. But if we're going to be seamless about cross-border payments, we've then got to rely, if we want this big digital African market, we've got to rely that the payments regulator in Kenya or in South Africa or in Nigeria is also doing that job, and that there's trust between those regulators, which is not always easy to achieve. And so a lot of work has to go into that in terms of mutual recognition of outcomes, in terms of building up shared standards, due diligence processes that are mutually recognized, for example, as well.
So how does your organization work specifically with Trademark? I'm just curious about that.
So at the moment, we're involved, I believe, in a project called the Trade Logistics Information Pipeline, the TLIP.
Yes, I've heard of it.
Exactly. And so that's being run by colleagues. And yeah, we're really excited to see how that can take off and hopefully serve some of the issues that I've raised here today.
Maybe you can break down for the audience what TLIP is.
So I can't, because it's not my area. So
Okay.
I would probably leave that best to colleagues, but there is some information online.
Okay, brilliant. And then I think it's so interesting to learn that you were in digital finance, probably 6 years ago,
Yeah.
maybe. Maybe it wasn't so much a thing then as it is now. But how does that fit into sort of your personal passion or your drive in terms of that? And then secondly, what are the impacts around doing what it is that you do in this space?
Yeah, so for me, my passion is to see how trade can drive economic and sustainable opportunities. So the digital economy is interesting because it's also a tool to achieve that economic opportunity and sustainability. So then when you put the two together, digital and trade, for me, that was really an exciting time to be working on those two together. And I've carried that forward now with a focus on sustainability, but trying to understand again how digital tools, how trade can help us achieve sustainable outcomes and goals.
Great. And maybe the last two questions I have for you before we close our conversation. The first would be, are there any specific things that maybe you'd like the audience to know or learn about that you would find useful, possibly helpful in terms of what your organization is doing? And then secondly, if people wanted to possibly reach you or your organization online, where could they find you?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last one. It's easy. Just go to WeForum and type in trade. You'll find a very nice website, lots of moving pictures, some videos, some blogs on what we do. We work on many different topics on trade, including all around the world. So you have to kind of go through the information that's there. And we'd be very happy to hear from people. But I think the key takeaway message of what I want people to know about the World Economic Forum and what we do on trade is that we facilitate dialogue between the private sector and government to help deliver ecosystems that work for these different, also that these opportunities that we've talked about are not left on the table. So we want a trade ecosystem that's driving development, that's driving sustainable growth. We want the digital economy to be really leveraged by actors to its maximum potential so that it's delivering those jobs that governments are looking for. But we believe that having that conversation between the private sector and government can be a key way to getting the settings right on both sides.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kimberley. It's been a pleasure. Your insights have been very inspiring and informative, and I hope our audience will find value in the same. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So that's been Kimberley from the World Economic Forum. She shared some really wonderful insights around sustainable trade as well as digital trade, looking at it from the lens of the World Economic Forum, and more importantly, at the conference that we're attending, the Africa Trade Development Forum, I think giving us a unique context coming from a global perspective in terms of how Africa can enhance its trade opportunities and possibilities across the continent. My name is Moses Kamibaro. I'm your host today once again for the Keep Africa Trading podcast, and we hope we can catch you in the next one for more conversations.